Father, we thank you again for the time we have together, for the marvels of modern technology, that we can make some connections with one another. Father, we pray that you might anoint this lesson today, that we might learn from the past, Father, that we might seek true unity in Christ our Lord. We offer up these prayers in his name. Amen. So today, chapter 31 of Bruce Shelley's church history book, his title is Unwilling to Die for an Idea, denominations. Now, in the outline I've created, I put in brackets, unwilling to die or kill for an idea. And it might seem like a counterintuitive or kind of strange way to talk about denominations. And there's a couple of different ways to approach denominations. What Shelley does is he looks at a number of wars, particularly the 30 Years' War, which I'll probably spend a lot of time on, maybe too much. And then we're going to look at the unique situation of early America, the religious diversity that America had. And if you put these two things together, these series of religious wars that lead to a kind of a reaction that we don't want to go down that road anymore, and then with the religious freedom and plurality in America, that kind of is really what Shelley's point is, I think, of how we came with such a diversity of denominations. There's a deeper background, which we did a couple months ago actually, I think at the end of January, after I prefaced some of the Reformation material, the Lutheran Reformation, the Church of England, the Swiss Reformation and all that. I prefaced it with this spectrum, this chart, where we kind of outline the most cautious Reformation is, of course, the Roman Catholic, or so-called Counter-Reformation, which generally only changes a few practices. Luther is much more bold than that. So is the Church of England. But then Calvin and Zwingli and the Calvinist Reformed tradition is even bolder. And then the Anabaptists, various Anabaptist groups are the most bold, or the so-called Radical Reformation. So if you want, you can look back at that outline from a few weeks ago. That gives you kind of a doctrinal basis where these groups differ on their view of God, of Christ, of salvation, of the church, so forth. And it also gives kind of a bit of a, if you will, a genealogical backdrop. But what I'm going to do today is a little bit different. It's not going to be looking at the doctrinal differences, but it's going to look more institutionally how these different groups arose. So I'm going to start with, and there's basically just two big points. The wars of religion in the 15 and 1600s, and then I'm going to look at the early America, its unique contribution to this religious plurality or diversity. So I titled the first section, I actually called it the so-called wars of religion. And I did that for a purpose because, as we'll see multiple times, history is not as nice and neat as, well, here's a war of nationalistic rivalry, here's a war of dynastic rivalry, here's a war of religious rivalry. But for better or worse, they've been labeled that. So I broke this up into several parts, so that point A, under the wars of religion, there was already religious division in Central Western Europe, even before the Protestant Reformation. And as we looked a few weeks ago, point 1 on section A, you already have a split, a schism, the great schism, between the Eastern Orthodox churches, which have a Greek philosophical background, and then the Roman Catholic West, which has a Latin background. And it's hard to put an exact date on that. Some scholars will say 1054. It's really so hardened or solidified that split in 1204 when the Western Knights slaughtered so many people in Constantinople and they sacked Constantinople. And really, the Byzantine Empire never recovered. It fell to the Muslims, Mehmet II in 1453, in part because it had been so weakened by the Western Knights. But also, we sometimes forget this. It's not just this big split between the Eastern Orthodox versus the Roman Catholic West, but in the early 1400s, Jan Hus, we looked at him a few weeks ago, There was a Hussite split in what's modern-day Czech Republic, Bohemia, and Moravia. We're going to talk about those regions a couple of times today because they're foundational. And these various groups, Hussite groups, the Uterquist or Calixtines, they're a bit more cautious in reform. And then the Taborites, they still are around in Luther's day, a century later. Huss is executed July 6, 1415 at the Council of Constance. So when Luther attacks his 95 Theses, October 31st, 1517, there's already a split there in the center of Europe, in Bohemia. But it's just a tiny, small handful of Hussite groups. So point B, let's look at the religious divisions in Central and Western Europe during the 1500s proper. When Luther comes along, the religious division goes viral. It just multiplies exceedingly. He can't really contain the reform. And much to his displeasure, many groups really went kind of crazy and extreme, departed from the Bible. You have all these various groups that are really pushing the envelope much further than Luther wanted to. So point 2 under B, as we talked about on the Lutheran Reformation, to understand his Reformation, it's important to understand what's going on politically. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, he's a really important person. He's born in 1500. He, I think, becomes Charles I, the King of Spain, in 1516. And then in 1519, he's elected as the Holy Roman Emperor. And I've got a map there where we can kind of look at that. The Holy Roman Empire is really hard for modern Americans to understand. It's very different from the normal empires we think of. First of all, its emperor was elected. There's these 7 electors from 1356, and then they add some new people who get to vote, the Elector of Bavaria, and so forth. But it's kind of like the Electoral College. And in order, the Habsburgs, they controlled it. They had the office of Holy Roman Emperor for several centuries, really until 1806 when it's dissolved at the time of Napoleon. But they didn't inherit the office. They basically had to bribe the electors to vote them in. And the way to bribe them is say, hey, if you vote for me, I'll still give you really strong state rights. So the King of Bohemia, you can still pretty much do what you want. Frederick the Wise, the protector of Luther, the elector of Saxony, you can pretty much do what you want. The Count of the Palatinate, the elector of Brandenburg, and so forth, that they were all given these special privileges. So it's a very weak office. And what made it even weaker, Charles V, he inherited all these offices from both sides of his family. He's not only the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, which is basically modern-day Germany and the surrounding areas, but he also controls what was the Spanish Netherlands, today the Netherlands or Holland and Belgium. He also controls pretty much half of Italy. He controls half of the New World, the Philippines, wherever the Spanish colony was. And his neighbors all felt threatened by it, particularly the French King Francis I. He's surrounded on every side by Charles V. And this is unheard of. In the 1520s and 30s, the Roman Catholic French King Francis I, he's before the Bourbons, the Valois dynasty, he made a formal alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent and the Muslim Ottoman Turks. So Charles V is a really powerful guy, but he's got the French against him, he's got the Muslim Ottoman Turks, he's got most of the Lutheran princes in Germany, some of the Catholic princes, they want a weak emperor, and even the popes are fighting against him because they want to take over his lands in Italy. So there's a lot going on there. He's like the king of the hill and people want to push him off. So with that backdrop, there's these series of wars called the Schmalkaldic Wars in the early 1500s. So point 3 here. They conclude after the Second Schmalkaldic War, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. And it's the first formal introduction into the Holy Roman Empire of a type of religious toleration. We wouldn't think it's that tolerant today, but it was a big deal in its own day. It allowed for the 300 plus German states, or whole states in the Holy Roman Empire, each local prince would decide the religion of the people. So in a given state, you had to be Catholic or Lutheran. It didn't allow Calvinist or Anabaptist or other groups. And it provided you could keep your property, but you had like a couple weeks. If you're in Bavaria, which is devoutly Catholic, you got to move. If you're in Brandenburg, Saxony, Protestant, if you're not Protestant, you've got to move. But it's the first time Europe recognized maybe we should have some plurality of different beliefs. But again, these wars are not purely religious. And I put in the note there, a key example is Maurice the Elector of Saxony. He was a Lutheran. But in the First Malcaldic War, he sides with the so-called Roman Catholic side, the side supporting Charles V, the Catholic Emperor. In the Second War, he joins most of the princes, kind of like pushing for states' rights. So even the wars in 1500s, they're not purely along religious lines. There's a lot of power politics going on. So there's this critical phrase there in point 3c there, in part of my Latin. Cus regio eos religio, or you could say hargi, religio. Who's the realm, his the religion. In other words, the local prince, whatever his religion was, if it's Catholic, you got to be Catholic or go to the next state over. If it's Lutheran, and you're not Lutheran, you got to go to the next state over. All right, now, point 4 here. And Shelley doesn't really deal with this, but I wanted to add it. There's some similarity going on in France. France is struggling mightily with these internal conflicts, and some of it's religious. The Huguenots, the French Protestants or Calvinists, they were fairly sizable for a time. And there's all these complex battles back and forth, which I'm not going to get into, just to mention a couple events. In 1572, one of the darkest episodes, probably the worst episode in the French Wars of Religion, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It wasn't just one day. It's the last part of August and throughout September. Estimates vary, but at least we think 10,000, maybe up to 30,000 Protestants were killed. And it's not Catherine de' Medici, this supposedly evil Machiavellian Italian queen, calling the shots. It was just mob violence. It was, in some places, totally spontaneous, just a chance to kill your hated Protestant neighbors. It's really ugly. And there's a lot of history about this, why the Bourbon dynasty and other groups later want to tarnish, oh, it was just this evil woman, Catherine de' Medici. No, it was the genuine population arising, kind of like the Hutus slaughtering the Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. But through a complex of reasons, a guy, Henry Bourbon, becomes the first Bourbon monarch in 1589. And he makes a deal. If he converts to Catholicism, at least outwardly, he can do what he wants, the privacy of his own home. He can become king. And supposedly he said Paris is worth a mass. In other words, he'll go to mass, go through the show, as long as he becomes king. So in 1598, he issues this important document, the Edict of Nantes, which is kind of like what happened in the Holy Roman Empire. It says, if the local prince, you follow his religion, except Catholicism was allowed everywhere in France. If the local prince is a Lutheran, you could be Lutheran or Catholic. But as we'll see, that's going to come crashing down a century later. In 1685, Louis XIV, there's a whole stages of getting rid of the Protestant liberties. In the Edict of Fontainebleau, pardon my French, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but Louis XIV just says, either convert to Catholicism or you've got to leave. We're not going to tolerate your existence anymore. Okay, now finally, our main event here, the 30 Years' War. So in 1618 to 1648, it's a very complicated war. We call it 30 Years' War. You could make a case it's 4 wars. It's maybe about 20 different wars. It's incredibly complicated. I'm just going to try to distill some main points of it. There was, as I said earlier, there was a crucial exception in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg. It only allows Lutherans and Roman Catholics. The problem was in Bohemia, like modern-day Czech Republic, there were a lot of Calvinists. And in 1618, they elected Frederick V, who was not a Lutheran or a Catholic, to be the new king of Bohemia. And that produces this big fight. Now, the war, initially, you could view it, the 30 Years' War, as a kind of civil war within German soil of Protestant versus Catholic. There's some truth to that. But even from 1618, from the very first day, you've got Roman Catholic princes. They don't like Protestantism, but they say, hey, this is a chance to weaken the emperor and strengthen my own power. And it's, as we're going to see, it's a big dynastic struggle between the Habsburg Empire, who controls Spain, the Netherlands, controls Austria, Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, versus the French Bourbons. In fact, in the last a decade and a half of the war, the last half of the war roughly, these two French cardinals, Richelieu and Mazarin, they're the advisors to Louis XIII, and then the infant, not the infant, but the child King Louis XIV. They're devout Roman Catholic cardinals, but they're insistent. They tell Louis XIII and XIV, yeah, we don't like Protestantism, and we're going to crush it at home, which Louis XIV eventually do, but we want to do anything to weaken our enemy, the Habsburgs. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the French help initially is just money, weapons, that type of thing, logistical support. But in the last decade and a half, they take up direct arms. They send thousands of men and troops to fight the various Habsburg troops. And another example of, again, that's just a key example of how this so-called war of religion, you've got Catholic fighting Catholic, you even got Protestant versus Protestant. In the last stages of the war, Denmark, Norway, which was at that time one country, in the early stages they were on the so-called Protestant side. And in the last few years, they so can't stand the Swedes that they joined the so-called Catholic side. So the 30 Years' War, it's really hard to describe, but let's go through some of its results at the Peace of Westphalia. So it's really important, not just for church history. It creates the modern nation state as we know it. The Holy Roman Emperor, that office is weakened. It was always weak, but now, after 1648, he has very little power. He's not just a ceremonial figurehead, but not much more than that. The empire itself is clearly in decline. Already by 1648, it looks anachronistic. It looks kind of something out of the feudal Middle Ages. It's this multilingual, multinational amalgamation. But it was already clear in 1648, the future is going to belong to France, Spain, England. It's going to belong to these nation states that have a strong centralized government. It's not going to belong to this 300-plus state feudal empire. And that's being generous. If I say 300 states in a country a little bigger than modern Germany, it's really a couple thousand. Because there were what we call these imperial knights. They owned a few hundred acres maybe. They had a type of autonomy. So it's just very fragmented. And in fact, that's one of the reasons, we don't have time to pursue it now, Germany doesn't become a nation state until 1871. That's really relatively late. But part of it is because of the empire doesn't dissolve until 1806, and really Napoleon has a big impact in reducing the number of states. In any case, we're going to see the Habsburg dynasty is going to decline, in this French Bourbon dynasty, and this young king, Louis XIV, they're going to be the rising power in Western Europe. Sweden, even though their commander, King Gustavus Adolphus, dies in battle, they're going to emerge as the key power of the Baltic. And then Brandenburg will later be Prussia. They're going to be important. Bavaria. There's a number of political consequences. Holland, the Dutch Republic, gets official recognition of its independence, so does Switzerland. All right, now, but for our purposes, religious purposes, it's clear by the last half of the 30 Years' War, people aren't fighting primarily for religious identity. That was probably true in the first stages. You could say it's the Protestant cause versus the Catholic. By the last half, that's been clearly replaced by national identity. France versus Spain, or dynastic identity. Bourbon versus Habsburg. And the irony is this, and I think a lot of historians are coming around to this view nowadays, but the myth kind of was, see how destructive wars of religion are? they're worse than other wars. I don't think that's true. If you look at the nationalistic wars and the wars produced by rationalistic dogma, and I'm thinking of Napoleonic Wars, the Enlightenment led to that, not religion. I'm thinking of World War I and World War II. They're much more lethal, much more destructive than these so-called religious wars. But by the end of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, it's clear that state authority is going to be independent now. Even Roman Catholic lands, the Bourbon monarchs, they are not going to kowtow to the Pope. They might pay lip service, but they're basically going to run their country as they want, including the church. In fact, they band together after the War of Spanish Succession. There's now a Bourbon in Spain and Portugal as well as France. And they get the Pope, I think it was Clement the 13th, to shut down the Jesuits. Why didn't they like the Jesuits? Because the Jesuits are loyal to the Pope above everyone else. And they say, no, you've got to be loyal to the King of France first. Pope comes second. So there's this increasing emphasis on the power of the state. But there is some expansion of religious toleration. So in 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, within the Holy Roman Empire, you got to be either Lutheran or Catholic. Now there's a recognition of the various Calvinist reform groups. Still, the Anabaptists weren't included. And then the final effect here, which I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. German soil was utterly devastated by these marauding armies from France, from Spain, from Sweden, from Denmark, all these various international armies and mercenaries. The common estimate is about 20% of the German population was killed outright. But depopulation is maybe 33 to 40%. Because people didn't want to live in those conditions, they leave. It took Germany more than a century to recover. And it's not just the sheer loss of life. Think about it, 20% of America today, you're talking about, what, 60, 65 million people dying in the space of 30 years. It's unfathomable. And the atrocities, too, there's this thing called the Schwedentrunk. It's German for the Swedish drink. And even though the Swedish commander Gustav Adolphus had very disciplined troops and he tried to give them normal pay, most of the armies at this time, they didn't get normal pay. Their only pay was pillaging and looting, which leads to starvation of the people you rob from. And if they didn't hand over the animal, but as the first time, some of the soldiers, they'd get sewage, animal waste, human waste, put it, and they'd force it down your gullet, liquid manure. It was just this horrible kind of atrocities. All right, so finishing up here then, let's look at the political religious map. And I've got two maps. One is like Europe in 2010, and one is from like the 1600s. The map is still startlingly similar. There's been some differences. So before 1648, we already saw that Protestantism was more dominant in the north of Europe, Roman Catholicism in the south. That will be intensified. So if you look at these maps, Lutheranism, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Scandinavia, the northern states of Germany, it's dominant. Calvinism, the Reformed tradition, dominant in Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, or Kirk, the Netherlands, right, the Dutch Calvinists, Switzerland, Geneva, Zurich, Calvinists mainly, and then certain Western German states. The Palatinate has some of the states on the Rhineland. The Church of England, and I don't want to offend anyone, but as I said a few weeks ago, it clearly is part of Protestantism. It's part of the Magisterial Reformation. It dominates just in English lands. But England has control of Ireland, which will remain Catholic, although there'll be some Church of England upper class who will migrate there. So while Protestantism, after the 30 Years' War, rises in the north, in the south, it's almost wiped out. Most notably in Bohemia, Moravia, the Czech Republic, which had been heavily not just followers of Huss, but a lot of Calvinists. They're almost all forced, killed, or forced to leave. So the Czech Czech lands, Bohemia and Moravia, become almost purely Roman Catholic. Spain and Italy were already almost 100% Roman Catholic. Austria, Bavaria, the southern German states will become increasingly Roman Catholic after this war. Okay, final point here on the wars of religion before we look at America. England's civil wars from 1642 to 1651, and then the Toleration Act of 1688 and the Glorious Revolution. So England's the reverse of France, kind of. Well, France in 1598, the Edict of Nantes, hey, the Huguenot, you're okay if you've got a Protestant noble in your land, in your local region, you can practice your religion, not in a Catholic, if there's a Catholic prince. But by 1685, Protestants lose all legal authority, legal toleration in France, and they're expelled. Excuse me. England goes the opposite. There's increasing toleration. People who hate Cromwell don't like to mention this, but he's the guy who in the 1650s invited the Jews back to England. They had been expelled in 1290 by Edward I. You might know from Braveheart fame. He doesn't just squash Welshmen and put all those castles there. He doesn't just torture Scotsmen. He doesn't like the Jews either and kicks them out of England. Cromwell brings them back. They can worship freely. And then in 1688, there's even more expansion. The Toleration Act of 1688. England will still support the Church of England. The tax money, all is going to support the Church of England. But Trinitarian dissenters and nonconformists, Presbyterians, Baptist Congregationalists, they'll legally be allowed to worship after 1688. Roman Catholics and Unitarians won't be allowed to worship legally, but they're not going to be hunted down. The unwritten rule is you can do what you want in private now. But it took several generations after 1688, even the Trinitarian dissenters, like Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, they couldn't hold civil or military office for several generations. Couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge and so forth. So they're not going to get to vote or any of that for several decades. All right, now, second point I'll be quicker on, the uniqueness of America. Well, our founding, it was very decentralized. In fact, I hesitate to say the 13 colonies because with 2020 hindsight, we can say there were 13, but it's not like in the 1600s, 1700s, people are saying, well, the British colonization, Canada, and the Caribbean are separate. No, in fact, what we call Massachusetts, for the longest time, it's the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Plymouth Colony. The so-called Puritans versus the so-called Pilgrims. In any case, you already see this diversity in the 1600s in what will become the United States of America. In New England, it's Congregationalism. They dominate Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, Connecticut, New Hampshire. Rhode Island's the exception. Roger Williams consciously made it a haven for pretty much any dissenter group. Christian or not, Quaker, all these groups are allowed in Rhode Island. The middle colonies are very much Presbyterian and Reformed. New York, obviously, Dutch Reformed. You know, before it was New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, before it became New York. Pennsylvania, a lot of the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. New Jersey, likewise. And then Delaware. So those colonies, population-wise, a lot of Presbyterian Reformed. But there were a lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania. It wasn't monolithic. The South is heavily Anglican or Episcopalian, and then later on, the Methodists will come. Until he died, I think in 1790, after we got our freedom, John Wesley was adamantly opposed. He did not want to separate and create a separate denomination. He was a good Church of England man until his dying day. But his corpse is barely cold, and the Methodists in America, they're already beginning to separate. So America, there's just this hands-off, what's called benign neglect. For generations, another country's really not messing with America, not really paying much attention. You can do what you want, kind of, as long as you're paying the taxes, which there'll be some tax protests. And so that attitude will change. So the early state constitutions then, they kind of reflect this early pattern. In New England, you get the Congregationalist church established. And again, the Congregationalists, they're very Calvinistic. They don't have as great of a structure, organized structure as Presbyterian, but very similar to Presbyterian. They have infant baptism. They're going to dominate in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and so forth. South Carolina, it's going to be Church of England. And people forget this, and I'm going to conclude in a minute here. We'll look at the U.S. Constitution, and then we'll be done. The states, for a long time, they still had established churches. For example, Connecticut did not disestablish the Congregationalist Church until 1818. And after that, Christianity was still the favored religion. It's just we're not going to favor one brand or flavor or denomination. Massachusetts, not until 1833, it disestablishes. It ends taxation on behalf of the Congregationalist Church. So you get all these campaigns, right? People who want to disestablish, and then you get those famous people who are against that, the anti-disestablishmentarians. I just wanted to use that word once in my life in a legitimate, that's really more of a British thing. We didn't really use it in America, that's late 19th century. To me, anti-disestablishmentarian, just call the guy an establishmentarian. You want the Church of England to get tax money. You don't want to turn St. Paul's into a mall or whatever, or a parking garage. All right, so point B here under Section 2, America, the Constitution, and I'm not a legal scholar, but I think I'm on firm ground in what I'm going to say. So first, point B1, the break with Britain allows us to have a kind of a blank slate. We don't have to have this national church model that was prevalent in Europe. And in any case, the 13 colonies are much more diverse than we sometimes realize, certainly economically. The pattern of slavery versus not slavery, that's already emerging. But if you read the Constitution carefully and look at the history, the principle of federalism, you can call it state rights, whatever, states' rights, whatever you want to call it, it's very clear. Each state, you could establish whatever religion you wanted. The First Amendment wording is very, very important. Okay? Before I get to that, let me do 3A before 3B. Article 6, Section 3 is important. It says no religious test can be applied for national office. So to become president, vice president, senator, U.S. congressman, you don't have to say, I believe in the Trinity or the Apostles' Creed. But the First Amendment is very clear. Go back and look at history. I was just in Washington in January, and you can see the proposed changes. What we call the First Amendment was really the third proposed amendment. The first two didn't pass. Actually, the first one passed in 1992. We now call it the 27th Amendment. But some people said the amendment should read, Congress shall not establish a religion. That's not what it says. It was voted down. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is a big deal. What the First Amendment is primarily saying, and so many historians, I think, get this wrong, I think they have an axe to grind. The First Amendment is saying, again, what's the first word of the First Amendment in the whole Bill of Rights? Congress. Congress, you don't make any laws respecting religion. Keep your hands off the states. If we want congregations to be established in Connecticut, you keep your hands off. You don't pass any law respecting establishment of religion. South Carolina, if those folks want Church of England, you keep your hands off it. So the First Amendment is actually protecting the many state establishments. And I don't know, it drives me crazy how many Supreme Court justices just ignore the clear history. And yet, case after case, we say, oh, it's because of the First Amendment. Baloney. The First Amendment doesn't say anything about the legislature of Arkansas. It says, Congress, you don't make any law. Yet this doctrine of incorporation, which maybe J.C. Baker or Bruce Hurlbut can explain, it's the idea that the 14th Amendment now applies the First Amendment to the states. Even if that's the case, there's some issues there. But the free exercise clauses also leave the states free to restrict religion as they propose. I have to say, I'm not a fan of state establishment. I don't think we should coerce people, figuratively put a gun to their head and say, you have to support the Presbyterian Church with your taxes. I actually don't think it's a good idea, but I don't think the First Amendment prohibits that. That's my point. Point 4 here, under the Constitution. Nowhere does the Constitution talk about separation of church and state. That's like what, from 1808, I think it is, Jefferson's letter to the Baptist Church in Danbury, Connecticut. But it is true, the Constitution envisions separate offices. So the mere fact that you're a bishop doesn't mean you're governor or president. So that idea, I think, is quite American. The founders, they wanted an official separation, the offices to be separate. Unlike Church of England, where, hey, if you're a bishop of York, you are a statesman and a churchman. You sit in the House of Lords, but they don't do much today. But historically, you were both a churchman and a statesman. You're mixing civil and ecclesiastical, political and church office. And most Americans were against that. Having said all this, though, in spite of what I think is the correct reading of the First Amendment in the Constitution, it's clear the Founding Fathers were pretty radical in religious liberty. The only parallels I can think of at the time of the Dutch Republic. Dutch Republic, they allowed Jews who were fleeing persecution in Spain, in Portugal. They allowed the Anabaptist groups. In fact, remember the Pilgrims, they had all the religious freedom they wanted in Holland. In fact, there was too much freedom. They said, this neighborhood is really going downhill. They came to America, not because they were being persecuted in Holland, but they wanted to have a more robust Christianity. So America goes beyond England's Act of Toleration. And then finally here, American religious pluralism, point C, section 2. I think religious pluralism is the inevitable result of Article 6, Section 3 of the Constitution, which I dealt with earlier. It's very clear, for federal national office, there can be no religious test. And the First Amendment is clear, there can't be a nationally established denomination. If you people in South Carolina want Anglicanism, fine. If you people in Connecticut want Congregationalism, fine, you can establish that. But each denomination, they were very jealous. We're not going to support. They didn't trust the other denominations, and rightly so. They don't want to have one national denomination. But I think what the Founding Fathers didn't envision was also inevitable, and I have the benefit of 2020 hindsight, which is that inevitably, it wouldn't be just different brands of Christianity that would flourish. Baptist, Congregationalist, Methodist, Lutheran, Mennonite, Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, but it would be many different religions. Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and ultimately irreligion and atheism would also flourish. So it's a really complex picture, but I think Shelley's instincts are sound. These so-called religious wars produced this reaction. Let's stop killing each other. This is important stuff, but we shouldn't be killing each other over it. In the public sphere, let's kind of find a way where we can tolerate. Tolerate in the classic sense. I'm going to let you live. It doesn't mean I'm going to say, oh, everything you say is true and I can't disagree with you. You can have robust debates and say, you're wrong, here's why. But you're not going to put someone in prison, fine them, or kill them anymore. And I think that's about it.